We're live. We're live.
Hi. Good evening. It's not popping up here.
Welcome. Is it working? Are you seeing your...
There we go.
Yeah?
Hello.
It is working? No one's joined. But... It is working? No one's joined? Yep. There you are. You wanted to watch yourself? You're the one person who's joined so far. But.
Well, that's good. I always want to have one, at least.
Not counting the two of us.
Yeah.
Wait, there's
three,
two.
Right?
Yeah. Someone else joined too.
Well, good evening.
I didn't join.
Yeah. We look forward to this time every week now.
We do. Tonight's chapters 9 and 10. I don't even want to think that we're halfway through, but we are. And we hope, Georgia started talking about the book in the sermon too, and how, and his read we mentioned last week about wanting it to be your first time reading it, and we hope that as our church reads this story, that we can be drawn into like the message of the beauty of Christ. Like, I were talking about this song earlier. We'll tell everyone to go read it. It's called Time, Just Time by John Lucas. And I heard it on the way home tonight, and it reminded me of Corrie's message, just how her eyes knew the glory, and that through hard times, like there's a time when laughter will echo through the halls of peace, but war is known to change your locks, carry off the family keys. Like, it's just, I think you'd enjoy the song thinking about this, and even thinking about tomorrow is election day.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a time right now where obviously our prayer is for peace, for the rest that Corrie is writing about. She's writing about all of these things that happened and her rest. Mm-hmm. She knew where to rest as she looks back. So do
check out the song and even look up the lyrics.
Yeah,
we could just read the really lyrics and talk about how all of it applies.
It's a long one, but it is really good. It is really good. We want to start?
We do want to start.
Reading. We got 2 chapters. We hate keeping everybody over, but we're glad you stayed.
Thanks. We're especially grateful, Peggy. And it's fun to know that we're with you every Monday.
And Nan, too, I think, is listening in.
Yeah, and anyone else who is. Sorry, we're just naming the folks we're particularly aware of. Mm-hmm. So chapter 9 is called The Raid. At the sound of someone in my room, I opened my eyes painfully. It was Yussi, carrying up his bedding and nightclothes to store in the secret room. Behind him came Mary and Thea with their bundles. I shut my eyes again. It was the morning of February 28th, 1944. For 2 days, I had been in bed with influenza. My head throbbed, my joints were on fire. Every little sound, Mary's wheeze, the scrape of the secret panel, made me want to shriek. I heard Hank and Meta come in, then Yussi's laugh as he handed the day things out to the others through the low door. Go away, all of you. Leave me alone. I bit my lip to keep from saying it. At last they collected their clothes and belongings and trooped out, closing the door behind them. Where was Leendert? Why hadn't he come up? Then I remembered that Leendert was away for a few days, setting up electrical warning systems like ours in several of our host homes. I drifted back into a feverish sleep. The next thing I knew, Betsy was standing at the foot of the bed, a steaming cup of herb tea in her hand. Sorry to wake you, Corrie, but there's a man down in the shop who insists he will talk only to you. Who is he? He says he's from Romello. I've never seen him before. I sat up shakily. That's all right. I have to get up anyway. Tomorrow the new ration cards come. I sipped the scalding tea, then struggled to my feet. There by the bed lay my prison bag, packed and ready as it had been since the summons from the chief of police. In fact, I've been adding to it. Besides the Bible, clothing, and toilet things, it now held vitamins, aspirins, iron pills for Betsy's anemia, and much else. It had become a kind of talisman for me, a safeguard against the terrors of prison. I got slowly into my clothes and stepped out onto the landing. The house seemed to reel around me. I crept down, clinging to the handrail. At the door to Tante Jan's rooms, I was surprised to hear voices. I looked in. Of course, I'd forgotten. It was Wednesday morning. People were gathering for Willem's weekly service. I saw Nolly passing around occupation coffee, as we call the current brew of roots and dried figs. Peter was already at the piano, as he was most weeks, to provide the music. I continued down around the stairs, passing new arrivals streaming up. As I arrived, wobble-kneed in the shop, a small, sandy-haired man sprang forward to meet me. "Miss Ten Boom." "Yes." There was an old Dutch expression. You can tell a man by the way he meets your eyes. This man seemed to concentrate somewhere between my nose and my chin. "Is it about a watch?" I asked. "No, Miss Ten Boom, something far more serious." His eyes seemed to make a circle around my face. "My wife has just been arrested. We've been hiding Jews, you see. If she is questioned, all of our lives are in danger." "I don't know how I can help," I said. "I need 600 guilders. There's a policeman at the station in Romello who can be bribed for that amount. I'm a poor man, and I've been told you have certain contacts." "Contacts?" "Miss Ten Boom, it's a matter of life and death. If I don't get it right away, she'll be taken to Amsterdam, and then it will be too late." Something about the man's behavior made me hesitate. And yet, how could I risk being wrong? "Come back in an hour. I'll have the money," I said. For the first time, the man's eyes met mine. "I'll never forget this," he said. The amount was more than we had at the Bayet, so I sent Toos to the bank with instructions to hand the man the money, but not to volunteer any information. Then I struggled back up the stairs. For 10 minutes earlier, I'd been burning with fever. Now I was shaking with cold. I stopped at Tante Jan's rooms just long enough to take a briefcase of papers from the desk. Then, with apologies to Willem and the others, I continued to my room. I undressed again, refilled the vaporizer where it was hissing in its small spirit stove, and climbed back into bed. For a while, I tried to concentrate on the names and addresses in the briefcase. 5 cars needed this month in Zandvoort, none in Overveen. We would need 18, and the flu roared behind my eyes. The paper swam in front of me. The briefcase slipped from my hand, and I was asleep. In my fevered dream, a buzzer kept ringing. On and on it went. Why wouldn't it stop? Feet were running, voices whispering, "Hurry, hurry!" I sat bolt upright. People were running past my bed. I turned just in time to see Thea's heels disappear through the low door. Maida was behind her, then Hank. But I hadn't planned a drill for today. Who in the world? Unless it wasn't a drill. Yussi dashed past me, white-faced, his pipe rattling in the ashtray that he carried in shaking hands. And at last it penetrated my numbed brain that the emergency had come. 1, 2, 3 people already in the secret room. 4 as Yussi's black shoes and scarlet socks disappeared. But Mary, where was Mary? The old woman appeared in the bedroom door, mouth open, gasping for air. I sprang from my bed and half pulled, half shoved her across the room. I was sliding the secret panel down behind her when a slim, white-haired man burst into the room. I recognized him from Pickwick, someone high in the National Resistance. I had no idea he was in the house. He dived after Mary. 5, 6. Yes, that was right, with leaned her away. The man's legs vanished, and I dropped to the panel and leapt back into bed. Below, I heard doors slamming, heavy footsteps on the stairs. But it was another sound that turned my blood to water. The strangling, grating rasp of Mary's breathing. Lord Jesus, I prayed, you have the power to heal. Heal Mary now. And then my eye fell on the briefcase, stuffed with names and addresses. I snatched it up, yanked up the sliding door again, flung the case inside, shoved the door down, and pushed my prison bag up against it. I just reached the bed again when the bedroom door flew open. "What's her name?" I sat up slowly and, I hoped, sleepily. "What? Your name?" "Corrie Ten Boom." The man was tall and heavy-set with a strange pale face. He wore an ordinary blue business suit. He turned and shouted down the stairs, "We've got one more up here, Williams." He turned back to me. "Get up, get dressed." As I crawled out from under the covers, the man took a slip of paper from his pocket and consulted it. "So you're the ringleader." He looked at me with new interest. "Tell me now, where are you hiding the Jews?" "I don't know what you're talking about." The man laughed. "And you don't know anything about an underground ring either. We'll see about that." He had not taken his eyes off me, so I began to pull on my clothes over my pajamas, ears straining for a sound from the secret room. "Let me see your papers." I pulled out the little sack that I wore around my neck. When I took out my identification folder, a roll of bills fell out with it. The man stooped, snatched up the money from the floor, and stuffed it into his pocket. Then he took my papers and looked at them. For a moment, the room was silent. Mary Attali's wheeze. Why wasn't I hearing it? The man threw the papers back at me. "Hurry up." But he was not in half the hurry I was to get away from the room. I buttoned my sweater all wrong in my haste and stuffed my feet into my shoes without bothering to tie them. Then I was about to reach for my prison bag. Wait. It stood where I had shoved it in my panic, directly in front of the secret panel. If I were to reach down under the shelf to get it now, with this man watching my every move, might not his attention be attracted to the last place on earth I wanted him to look? It was the hardest thing I'd ever done to turn and walk out of that room, leaving the bag behind. You want to pick up?
Yeah. Really quick just to touch base because she called it her talisman. And, kind of where she was, a little bit of her is putting faith in carrying this bag and having everything she needed. And yet she's still clinging to the Lord. No, I'm giving it up.
Right. Yeah, it's so hard because we feel that. We're like, she was so prepared. She knew. And yet it makes me think about Jesus sending out the 70, right? And he says, take nothing with you. God will provide for you. Yeah.
I stumbled down the stairs, my knees shaking as much from fear as from flu. A uniformed soldier was stationed in front of Tante Jan's rooms.
Call for Rob. It's from Pike House.
Hang on. I thought I had... Sorry.
Sorry.
My son John is from Wilmington. I take it he's not watching us read.
Can't believe it.
I stumbled down the stairs, my knees shaking as much from fear as from the flu. A uniformed soldier was stationed in front of Tante Jan's rooms. The door was shut. I wondered if the prayer meeting had ended, if Willem and Nolly and Peter had gotten away. Or were they all still in there? How many innocent people might be involved? The man behind me gave me a little push, and I hurried on down the stairs to the dining room. Father, Betsy, and Toos were sitting on chairs pulled back against the wall. Beside them sat 3 underground workers who must have arrived since I had gone upstairs. On the floor beneath the window, broken in 3 pieces, lay the Alpina sign. Someone had managed to knock it from the sill. A second Gestapo agent in plainclothes was pawing eagerly through a pile of silver rich dollars and jewelry heaped on the dining room table. It was the cash from the space behind the corner cupboard. It had been indeed the first place they looked. Here's the other one listed at the address, said the man who had brought me down. My information says she's the leader of the whole outfit. The man at the table, the one called Willem C., glanced at me and then turned to the loot in front of him. You know what to do, Captain. Captain seized me by the elbow and shoved me ahead of him down the remaining 5 steps and into the rear of the shop. Another soldier in uniform stood guard just inside this door. Captain prodded me through the front room and pushed me against the wall. Where are the Jews? There aren't any Jews here. The man struck me hard across the face. Where do you hide the ration cards? I don't know what Captain hit me again. I staggered up against the astronomical clock. Before I could recover, he slapped me again and then again and again, stinging blows that jerked my head backwards. Where are the Jews? Another blow. Where is your secret room? I tasted blood in my mouth. My head spun, my ears rang. I was losing consciousness. Lord Jesus, I cried out, protect me. Captain's hand stopped in midair. If you say that name again, I'll kill you. But instead, his arm slowly dropped to his side. If you won't talk, that skinny one will. I stumbled ahead of him up the stairs. He pushed me into one of the chairs against the dining room wall. Through a blur, I saw him lead Betsy from the room. Above us, hammer blows and splintering wood showed where a squad of trained searchers were probing for the secret room. Then, down in the alley, the doorbell rang. But the sign! Didn't they see the Alpina sign was gone? And I glanced at the window and caught my breath. There on the sill, the broken pieces, fitted carefully together, sat the wooden triangle. Too late, I looked up to see Willemse staring intently at me. I thought so, he said. It was a signal, wasn't it? He ran down the stairs. Above us, the hammering and the tramp of boots had stopped. I heard the alley door open and Willemse's voice smooth and ingratiating. Come in, won't you? Have you heard? A woman's voice. They've got Herman. Pickwick, not Pickwick. Oh, I heard Willemse say. Who was with him? He pumped her as hard as he could, then placed her under arrest. Blinking with fright and confusion, the woman was seated with us along the wall. I recognized her only as a person who occasionally took message for us about the city. I stared in anguish at the sign in the window announcing to the world that all was as usual at the Bayet. Our home had been turned into a trap. How many more would fall into it before this day was over? And Pickwick, had they really caught Pickwick? Captain appeared with Betsy in the dining room door. Her lips were swollen and puffy. A bruise was darkening on her cheek. She half fell into the chair next to mine. Oh, Betsy, he hurt you. Yes, she dabbed at the blood on her mouth. I feel so sorry for him. Wow.
Betsy's responses.
Yeah.
I
They're lovely and awfully hard to grasp at times.
Yeah.
Captain whirled his white face even paler. Prisoners will remain silent, he shrieked. Two men were clumping down the stairs and into the dining room, carrying something between them. They had discovered the old radio beneath the stairs. Law-abiding citizens, are you? Captain went on. You, the old man there. I see you believe in the Bible. He jerked his thumb at the well-worn book on its shelf. Tell me, what does it say in there about obeying the government? Fear God, Father quoted, and on his lips in that room the words came as blessing and reassurance. Fear God and honor the Queen. Captain stared at him. It doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say that. No, Father admitted. It says fear God and honor the King, but in our case, that's the Queen. It's not king or queen, roared Captain. We're the legal government now, and you're all lawbreakers. The doorbell rang again. Again, there were the questions and the arrest. The young man, one of our workers, had barely been assigned a chair when again the bell sounded. It seemed to me that we had never had so many callers. The dining room was getting crowded. I felt sorriest for those who had come simply on social visits. An elderly retired missionary was brought in, jaw quivering with fear. At least from the banging and thumping above, they had not yet discovered the secret room. A new sound made me jump. The phone down the hall was ringing. That's a telephone, cried Willemse. He glared around the room. Then, grabbing me by the wrist, yanked me down the stairs behind him. He thrust the receiver up against my ear, but kept his own hand on it. Answer, he said with his lips. This is the Ten Boom residence and shop, I said as stiffly as I dared. But the person on the other end did not catch the strangeness. Miss Ten Boom, you're in terrible danger. They've arrested Herman Sluring. They know everything. You've got to be careful. On and on the woman's voice babbled, the man at my side hearing everything. She had scarcely hung up when the phone rang again. A man's voice, and again the message. Herman's been taken to the police station. That means they're on to everything. At last, the third time, I repeated my formal and untypical little greeting. There was a click on the other end. Willemse snatched the earpiece from my hand. Hello, hello, he shouted. He jiggled the cradle on the wall. The line had gone dead. He shoved me back up the stairs and into my chair again. Our friends wised up, he told Captain, but I heard enough. Apparently, Betsy had received permission to leave her chair. She was slicing bread at the sideboard. I was surprised to realize it was already lunchtime. Betsy passed the bread around the room, but I shook my head. The fever was raging again. My throat ached and my head throbbed. A man appeared in the doorway. We've searched the whole place, Willemse said. If there's a secret room here, the devil himself built it.
Quite the opposite.
Quite the opposite. Willemse looked from Betsy to father to me. There's a secret room, he said quietly, and people are using it, or they would have admitted it. All right, we'll set a guard around the house till they've turned to mummies. In the hush of horror that followed, there was a gentle pressure on my knees. Maher Shalal Hashbaz had jumped up into my lap to rub against me. I stroked the shining black fur. What would become of him now? I would not let myself think about the 6 people upstairs. It had been half an hour since the doorbell had rung last. Whoever had caught my message over the phone must have spread the alarm. Word was out. No one else would walk into the trap at the Bayeux. Apparently, Willemse had come to the same conclusion because abruptly he ordered us on our feet and down the hallway with our coats and hats. Father, Betsy, and me he held in the dining room till last. In front of us, down the stairs, came the people from Tante Jan's rooms. I held my breath, scanning them. Apparently, most of those at the prayer service had left before the raid, but by no means all. Here came Nolly, behind her Peter. Last in the line came Willem. The whole family then. Father, all 4 of his children, 1 grandchild. Captain gave me a shove. Get moving. Father took his tall hat from the wall peg. Outside the dining room door, he paused to pull up the weights on the old Frisian clock. We mustn't let the clock run down, he said. Father, did you really think we'd be back home when the next chain ran out? The snow had gone from the streets. Puddles of dirty water stood in the gutters as we marched through the alley and into the Smeedstraat. The walk took only a minute, but by the time we got inside the double doors of the police station, I was shaking with cold. I looked anxiously around the foyer for Rolf and the others we knew, but I saw no one. A contingent of German soldiers seemed to be supplementing the regular police force.
Isn't it fascinating, the reminder that they are a minute from the police station, and yet they've been running the underground event for months at this point.
All the police needed watch repair.
Yeah.
All that too.
All right. We were herded along a corridor and through the heavy metal door where I had last seen Harry DeVries. At the end of this hall was a large room that had obviously been a gymnasium. Windows high in the walls were covered with wire mesh. Rings and basketball hoops were roped to the ceiling. Now a desk stood in the center of the room with a German army officer seated behind it. Tumbling mats had been spread out to cover part of the floor, and I collapsed onto one of them. For 2 hours, the officer took down names, addresses, and other statistics. I counted those who had been arrested with us. 35 people from the raid on the Bayeux. People from previous arrests were sitting or lying about on the mats too, some of them faces we knew. I looked for Pickwick, but he was not among them. One of them, a fellow watchmaker who often came to the Bayeux on business, seemed especially distressed at what had happened to us. He came and sat down beside Father and me. At last the officer left. For the first time since the alarm buzzer sounded, we could talk among ourselves. I struggled to sit up. Quick, I croaked. We've got to agree on what to say. Most of us can simply tell the truth, but my voice died in my throat. It seemed to my flu-addled brain that Peter was giving me the most ferocious frown I had ever seen. But if they learned that Uncle Willem was teaching this morning from the Old Testament, it could make trouble for him, Peter finished for me. He jerked his head to one side, and I clambered unsteadily to my feet. Auntie Corrie, he hissed when we were on the other side of the room. That man, the watchmaker, he's a Gestapo plant. He patted my head as though I were a sick child. Lie down again, Auntie Corrie. Just for heaven's sake, don't do any talking. I was waked by the heavy door of the gym slamming open. In strode Rolf. Let's have it quiet in here, he shouted. He leaned close to Willem and said something I could not hear. Toilets are out back, he continued in a loud voice. You can go one at a time, under escort. Willem sat down beside me. He says we can flush incriminating papers if we shred them fine enough. I fumbled through my coat pockets. There were several scraps of paper and a billfold containing a few paper Rijksdaalders. That's one of, I'm sorry, I try to look up some of these words. Money. Some of their money. Rijksdaalders. I went over each item, trying to think how I would explain it in a court process. Beside the row of outdoor toilets was a basin with a tin cup on a chain. Gratefully, I took a long drink, the first since the tea Betsy had brought me that morning. Toward evening, a policeman carried into the gym a large basket of fresh hot rolls. I could not swallow mine, only the water tasted good to me, though I grew embarrassed at asking again and again to be taken outside. When I got back the last time, a group had gathered around Father for evening prayers. Every day of my life had ended like this. That deep, steady voice, that sure and eager confiding of us all to the care of God. The Bible lay at home on its shelf, but much of it was stored in his heart. His blue eyes seemed to be seen beyond the locked and crowded room, beyond Harlem, beyond earth itself, as he quoted from memory, Thou art my hiding place and my shield. I hope in thy word. Hold thou me up, and I shall be safe. None of us slept much. Each time someone left the room, he had to step over a dozen others. At last, light crept through the high screen windows at the top of the room. The police again brought rolls. As the long morning wore on, I dozed with my back up against the wall. The worst pain now seemed to be in my chest. It was noon when soldiers entered the room and ordered us on our feet. Hastily, we struggled into our coats and filed again through the cold corridors. In the Smeedstraat, a wall of people pressed against police barricades set across the street. As Betsy and I stepped out with Father between us, a murmur of horror greeted the sight of Harlem's grand old man being led to prison. In front of the door stood a green city bus with soldiers occupying the rear seats. People were climbing aboard while friends and relatives in the crowd wept or simply stared. Betsy and I gripped Father's arms to start down the steps. Then we froze. Stumbling past us between two soldiers, hatless and coatless, came Pickwick. The top of his bald head was a welter of bruises. Dried blood clung to the stubble on his chin. He did not look up as he was hauled onto the bus. Father, Betsy, and I squeezed into a double seat near the front. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of teens standing in the crowd. It was one of those radiant winter days when the air seemed to shimmer with light. The bus shuddered and started up. Police cleared a path and we inched forward. I gazed hungrily out the window, holding onto Harlem with my eyes. Now we were crossing the Grote Markt, with walls of the great cathedral glowing 1,000 shades of gray in the crystal light. In a strange way, it seemed to me that I had lived through this moment before. Then I recalled the vision, the night of the invasion. I had seen it all. Willem, Nolly, Pickwick, Peter, all of us here, drawn against our wills across this square. It had all been in the dream, all of us leaving Harlem, unable to turn back. Going where? It's happening.
Chapter 10. Scheveningen. Scheveningen. Doesn't sound like a place I'd want to go either.
No.
Outside Harlem, the bus took the South Road, paralleling the sea. On our right rose the low and sandy hills of the dune country, soldiers silhouetted on the ridges. Clearly, we were not being taken to Amsterdam. A 2-hour drive brought us instead to the streets of The Hague. The bus stopped in front of the new functional building. Word was whispered back that this was the Gestapo headquarters for all of Holland. We were marched, all but Pickwick, who seemed unable to rise out of his seat, into a large room where the endless process of taking down names, addresses, and occupations began all over again. On the other side of the high counter, running the length of the room, I was startled to see both Willemse and Captain. As each of the prisoners from Harlem reached the desk, one or the other would lean forward and speak to a man seated at a typewriter, and there would be a clatter of sound from the machine. Suddenly, the chief interrogator's eyes fell on Father. "That old man?" he cried. "Did he have to be arrested? You, old man?" Willem led Father up to the desk. The Gestapo chief leaned forward. "I'd like to send you home, old fellow," he said. "I'll take your word that you won't cause any more trouble." I could not see Father's face, only the erect carriage of his shoulders and the halo of white hair above them. But I heard his answer. "If I go home today," he said, evenly and clearly, "tomorrow I will open my door again to any man in need who knocks." The amiability drained from the other man's face. "Get back in line," he shouted. "Schnell! This court will tolerate no more delays." But delays seemed all that this court existed for. As we inched along the counter, there were endless repetitions of questions, endless consulting of papers, endless coming and going of officials. Outside the windows, the short winter day was fading. We had not eaten since the rolls and water at dawn. Ahead of me in line, Betsy answered, unmarried, for the 20th time that day. "Number of children?" droned the interrogator. "I'm unmarried," Betsy repeated. The man did not even look up from his papers. "Number of children?" he snapped. "No children," said Betsy resignedly. Toward nightfall, a stout little man wearing the yellow star was led past us to the far end of the room. A sound of scuffling made us all look up. The wretched man was attempting to hold on to something clutched in his hands. "It's mine," he kept shouting. "You can't take it. You can't take my purse." What madness possessed him? What good did he imagine money would do him now? But he continued to struggle, to the obvious glee of the men around him. "Here, Jew," I heard one of them say. He lifted his booted foot and kicked the small man in the back of his knees. "This is how we take things from a Jew." It made so much noise. That was all I could think as they continued to kick him. I clutched the counter to keep from falling myself as the sounds continued. Wildly, unreasonably, I hated the man being kicked. I hated him for being so helpless and so hurt. At last, I heard them drag him out.
It's interesting. I just I've seen similar statements to that in other Holocaust memoirs, where people who we've grown to know and care about and love have these responses that they recognize are really unkind or really honestly inhuman, and we're seeing that process quickly happen. I mean, she is sick. She's out of her mind a little bit, but just that when people are treated inhumanly, they start feeling inhuman and they start seeing others less humanly as well. It's harder to care.
But it's also a rationality too. Like, she's getting to that place rationally in saying, like, man, if you would just stop, if you would just stop.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly here, wow. I mean, sometimes hasn't that been our first response to brutality? well, if you had just answered his questions. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's a humbling place, like, right?
Mhm.
Like how to love like our enemies all the time, you know, like think of like, yeah, I'm Jesus' response to Pilate. It is as you say, you know, like no defense.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Heavy.
Yeah.
It
And
is
I mean,
heavy.
it makes me think too, not to linger here too long, but he hated him for being helpless and hurt.
Mhm.
And in some ways, you think about Christ, right? Like taking on
Right.
the beatings and the physical and verbal violence, and that was the response of some of the disciples, right? Some of his people,
Sure.
like, what, do something, and
Yeah. Peter. I
yeah,
don't even know who that is. Who are you talking about? You know.
and so we do have a Christ that was identified with us in our sufferings,
Mhm.
and didn't need to be pitied, right? I mean, he was going to win. he won.
Yeah.
He was victorious.
He didn't need our pity.
Right.
We needed it.
Yeah.
You know, like she is needing it now. Right. Wow. Sorry to pause and
Yeah.
digress, but
We were making good time. It was 8:30 when we finished
Yeah.
the first chapter. So
oh well.
so we're
We
not
got to talking.
Anyone who's still hanging around with us
This
knows
is just yeah.
this is part of it.
It is just. It's also to keep it. You know, maybe the pauses are helping us not weep and be heavy. So it is heavy. It's a heavy place. We live in beautiful, hard places. So. At last I heard them drag him out. Then all at once I was standing in front of the chief questioner. I looked up and met Captain's eyes just behind him. This woman was the ringleader, he said. And in case you're wondering, like, you know, all of this is like my Hogan's Heroes. I pick up those
That's where you got your accent.
English Nazi accents.
Yeah.
The ones that make you just cackle because, wait, they spoke German.
Right.
You know?
Hogan's Heroes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Through the turmoil inside me, I realized it was important for the other man to believe him. What Mr. Captain says is true, I said. These others, they know nothing about it. It was all my name, the interrogator inquired imperturbably. Corrie Ten Boom. And I'm the age 52. The rest of these people had nothing to do. Occupation. But I've told you a dozen times, I burst out in desperation. Occupation, he repeated. It was dark night when we were marched at last out of the building. The green bus was gone. Instead, we made out the bulk of a large canvas roofed army truck. 2 soldiers had to lift Father over the tailgate. There was no sign of Pickwick. Father, Betsy, and I found places to sit on a narrow bench that ran around the sides. The truck had no springs and bounced roughly over the bomb-pitted streets of The Hague. I slipped my arm behind Father's back to keep him from striking the edge. Willem, standing near the back, whispered back what he could see of the blacked-out city. We had left the downtown section and seemed to be headed west toward the suburb of Scheveningen. That was our destination then, the federal penitentiary named after this seaside town. The truck jerked to a halt. We heard a screech of iron. We bumped forward a few feet and stopped again. Behind us, massive gates clanged shut. We climbed down to find ourselves in an enormous courtyard surrounded by a high brick wall. The truck had backed up to a long, low building. Soldiers prodded us inside. I blinked in the white glare of the bright ceiling lights. Mason, Gagan, Mauer. Noses to the wall. Probably even worse than that. Nasengegenmauer. I felt a shove from behind and found myself staring at cracked plaster. I turned my eyes as far as I could. First left and then right. There was Willem. 2 places away from him, Betsy. Next to me on the other side was Toos. All like me, standing with their faces to the wall. Where was Father? There was an endless wait while the scars on the wall before my eyes became faces, landscapes, animal shapes. Then somewhere to the right, a door opened. "Women prisoners, follow me!" The matron's voice sounded as metallic as the squealing door. As I stepped away from the wall, I glanced swiftly around the room for Father. There he was, a few feet out from the wall, seated in a straight-back chair. One of the guards must have brought it for him.
Already, the matron was starting down the long corridor that I could see through a door. But I hung back, gazing desperately at Father, Willem, Peter, all our brave underground workers. "Father," I cried suddenly, "God be with you." His head turned toward me. The harsh overhead light flashed from his glasses. "And with you, my daughters," he said. I turned and followed the others. Behind me, the door slammed closed. "And with you. And with you. Oh, Father, when will I see you next?" Betsy's hand slipped around mine. A strip of coconut palm matting ran down the center of the wide hall. We stepped onto it off the damp concrete. "Prisoners, walk to the side." It was the bored voice of the guard behind us. Oh, I didn't sound very bored when I said that. "Prisoners, walk to the side." It was the bored voice of the guard behind us. "Prisoners must not step on the matting." Guiltily, we stepped off the privileged path. Ahead of us in the corridor was a desk, behind it a woman in uniform. As each prisoner reached this point, she gave her name for the 1,000th time that day and placed on the desk whatever she was wearing of value. Nolly, Betsy, and I unstrapped our beautiful wristwatches. As I handed mine to the officer, she pointed to the simple gold ring that had belonged to Mama. I wriggled it from my finger and laid it on the desk along with my wallet and paper guilders. The procession down the corridor continued. The walls on both sides of us were lined with narrow metal doors. Now the column of women halted. The matron was fitting a key into one of them. We heard the thud of a bolt drawn back, the screech of hinges. The matron consulted a list in her hand, then called the name of a lady I didn't even know, one of those who had been at Willem's prayer meeting. Was it possible that that had been only yesterday? Was this only Thursday night? Already the events at the Bayes seemed part of another lifetime. The door banged shut, the column moved on, another door unlocked, another human being closed behind it. No 2 from Harlem in the same cell. Among the very first names read from the list was Betsy's. She stepped through the door. Before she could turn or say goodbye, it had closed. 2 cells farther on, Nolly left me. The clang of those 2 doors rang in my ears as the slow march continued. Now the corridor branched and we turned left, then right, then left again, an endless whirl of steel and concrete. Ten Boom, Cornelia. Another door rasped open. The cell was deep and narrow, scarcely wider than the door. A woman lay on the single cot, 3 others on straw ticks on the floor. "Give this one the cot," the matron said. "She's sick." And indeed, even as the door slammed behind me, a spasm of coughing seized my chest and throat. "We don't want a sick woman in here," someone shouted. They were stumbling to their feet, backing as far from me as the narrow cubicle would allow. I'm so very sorry," I began, but another voice interrupted me. "Don't be. It isn't your fault. Come on, Frau Mikes, give her the cot." The young woman turned to me. "Let me hang up your hat and coat." Gratefully, I handed her my hat, which she added to a row of clothes hanging from hooks along one wall. But I kept my coat wrapped right around me. The cot had been vacated, and I moved shakily toward it, trying not to sneeze or breathe as I squeezed past my cellmates. I sank down in the narrow bed and went back into a fresh paroxysm of coughs as a cloud of choking black dust rose from the filthy straw mattress. At last, the attack passed, and I lay down. The sour straw smell filled my nostrils. I felt each slot of wood through the thin palate. I will never be able to sleep on such a bed, I thought. And the next thing I knew, it was morning, and there was a clattering at the door. Food call, my cellmates told me. I struggled to my feet. A square of metal had dropped open in the door, forming a small shelf. Onto this, someone in the hall was placing 10 plates filled with a steaming gruel. There's a new one here, the woman called. Frau Mikes called through the aperture. We got 5 portions. Another 10 plate was slammed onto the shelf. If you're not hungry, Frau Mikes added, I'll help you with it. I picked up my plate, stared at the watery gray porridge, and handed it silently to her. In a little while, the plates were collected in the pass-through, and the door slammed shut. Later in the morning, a key grated in the lock, the bolt banged, and the door opened long enough for the sanitary bucket to be passed out. The wash basin was also emptied and returned with clean water. The women picked up their straw pallets from the floor and piled them in a corner, raising a fresh storm of dust, which started me coughing helplessly again. Then a prison boredom, which I soon learned to fear above all else, settled over the cell. At first, I attempted to relieve it by talking with the others, but though they were as courteous as people can be who are living literally on top of one another, they turned aside my questions, and I never learned much about them. The young woman who had spoken kindly to me the night before, I did discover was a baroness, only 17 years old. This young girl paced constantly, from morning until the overhead light bulb went off at night, 6 steps to the door, 6 steps back, dodging those sitting on the floor back and forth like an animal in a cage. Frau Mikes turned out to be an Austrian woman who had worked as a charwoman in an office building. She often cried for her canary. Poor little thing, what will become of him? They'll never think to feed him. This would start me thinking about our cat. Had Maher Shalal Hashbaz made his escape onto the street, or was he starving inside the sealed house? I would picture him prowling among the chair legs in the dining room, missing the shoulders he loved to walk on. I tried not to let my mind venture higher in the house, not to let it climb the stairs to see if they marry Yusi. No, I could do nothing for them here in the cell. God knew they were there. One of my cellmates had spent 3 years here in Scheveningen. She could hear the rattle of the meal cart long before the rest of us and tell by the footstep who was passing in the corridor. That's the trustee from medical supply. Someone's sick. This is the 4th time someone from 316 has gone for a hearing. Her world consisted of this cubicle and the corridor outside, and soon I began to see the wisdom of this narrow division, and why prisoners instinctively shied away from questions about their larger lives. For the first days of my imprisonment, I stayed in a frenzy of anxiety about Father, Betsy, Willem, Pickwick. Was Father able to eat this food? Was Betsy's blanket as thin as this one? But these thoughts led to such despair that I soon learned not to give in to them. In an effort to fix my mind on something, I asked Frau Mikes to teach me the card game that she played hour after hour. She had made the cards herself with the squares of toilet paper that were issued 2 a day to each prisoner. All day she sat on a corner of the cot, endlessly laying them out in front of her and gathering them up again. I was a slow learner, since no cards of any kind had been played at the Bayet. Now, as I began to grasp the solitaire game, I wondered what Father's resistance to them had been. Surely nothing could be more innocent than the succession of shapes called clubs, spades, diamonds. But as the days passed, I began to discover a subtle danger. When the cards went well, my spirits rose. It was an omen. Someone from Haarlem had been released. But if I lost, maybe someone was ill. The people in our secret room had been found. At last, I had to stop playing. In any case, I was finding it hard to sit up so long. Increasingly, I was spending the days as I did the nights, tossing on the thin straw pallet, trying in vain to find a position in which all aches at once were eased. My head throbbed continually. Pain shot up and down my arms. My cough brought up blood. I was thrashing feverishly on the cot one morning when the cell door opened and there stood the steel-voiced matron. I had seen the night I entered the cell 2 weeks before. Ten Boom, Cornelia. I struggled to my feet. Bring your hat and your coat and come with me. I looked around at the others for a hint as to what was happening. You're going into the outside, our prison expert said. When you take your hat, you always go outside. My coat was wearing already, but I took my hat from its hook and stepped out into the corridor. The matron relocked the door, then set off so rapidly that my heart hammered as I trotted after her, careful to stay off the precious matting. I stared yearningly at the locked doors on either side of us. I could not remember which ones my sisters had disappeared, behind which ones my sisters had disappeared. At last, we stepped out into the broad, high-walled courtyard. Sky. For the first time in 2 weeks, blue sky. How high the clouds were, how inexpressibly white and clean. I remembered suddenly how much sky had meant to Mama. Quick, snapped the matron. You want to pick up?
Yeah, sure. I hurried to the shiny black automobile beside which she was standing. She opened the rear door, and I got in. 2 others were already in the back seat, a soldier and a woman with a gaunt gray face. In front, next to the driver, slumped a desperately ill-looking man whose head lolled strangely on the seat back. As the car started up, the woman beside me lifted a blood-stained towel to her mouth and coughed into it. I understood. The 3 of us were ill. Perhaps we were going to a hospital. The massive prison gate opened and we were in the outside world, spinning along the broad city streets. I stared in wonderment through the window. People walking, looking in store windows, stopping to talk with friends. Had I truly been as free as that only 2 weeks ago? The car parked before an office building. It took both the soldier and the driver to get the sick man up the 3 flights of stairs. We entered a waiting room jammed with people and sat down under the watchful eyes of the soldier. When nearly an hour had passed, I asked permission to use the lavatory. The soldier spoke to the trim, white uniformed nurse behind the reception desk. "This way," she said crisply. She took me down a short hall, stepped into the bathroom with me, and shut the door. "Quick, is there any way I can help?" I blinked at her. Yes, oh yes, a Bible. Could you get me a Bible? And a needle and thread? And a toothbrush and soap? She bit her lip doubtfully. So many patients today, and the soldier. But I'll do what I can. And she was gone. But her kindness shone in the little room as brightly as the gleaming white tiles and shiny faucets. My heart soared as I scrubbed the grime off my neck and face. A man's voice at the door. "Come on, you've been in there long enough." Hastily, I rinsed off the soap and followed the soldier back to the waiting room. The nurse was back at her desk, coolly efficient as before. She did not look up. After another long wait, my name was called. The doctor asked me to cough, took my temperature and blood pressure, applied his stethoscope, and announced that I had pleurisy with effusion, pre-tubercular. He wrote something on a sheet of paper, and then with one hand on the doorknob, he laid the other for an instant on my shoulder. "I hope," he said in a low voice, "that I am doing you a favor with this diagnosis." In the waiting room, the soldier was on his feet ready for me. As I crossed the room, the nurse rose briskly from her desk and swished past me. In my hand, I felt a small knobby something wrapped in paper. I slid it into my coat pocket as I followed the soldier down the stairs. The other woman was already back in the car. The sick man did not reappear. All during the return ride, my hand kept straying to the object in my pocket, stroking it, tracing the outline. Lord, it's so small, but still it could be. Let it be a Bible. The high walls loomed ahead. The gate rang shut behind us. At last, at the end of the long, echoing corridors, I reached my cell and drew the package from my pocket. My cellmates crowded around me as I unwrapped the newspaper with trembling hands. Even the Baroness stopped her pacing to watch. As 2 bars of precious pre-war soap appeared, Frau Meix clapped her hand over her mouth to suppress her yelp of triumph. No toothbrush or needle, but unheard of wealth. A whole packet of safety pins. And most wonderful of all, not indeed a whole Bible, but in 4 small booklets, the 4 Gospels. I shared the soap and pens among the 5 of us, but though I offered to divide the books as well, they refused. They catch you with those, the knowledgeable one said, and it's a double sentence. And cult coast as well. Cult coast. The bread ration alone, without the daily plate of hot food, was the punishment of constantly held over our heads. If we made too much noise, we'd have cult coast. If we were slow with the bucket, it would be cult coast. But even cult coast would be a small price to pay, I thought as I stretched my aching body on the foul straw. For the precious books I clutched between my hands. It was 2 evenings later, near the time when the light bulb usually flickered off, that the cell door banged open and the guard strode in. Ten Boom, Cornelia, she snapped. Get your things. I stared at her, an insane hope rising in me. You mean? Silence, no talking. It did not take long to gather my things. My hat had an undervest that was drying after a vain attempt to get it clean in the much-used basin water. My coat, with the precious contents of its pockets, had never yet been off my back. Why such strict silence, I wondered. Why should I not be allowed even a goodbye to my cellmates? Would it be so very wrong for a guard to smile now and then, or give a few words of explanation? I said farewell to the others with my eyes and followed the stiff-backed woman into the hall. She paused to lock the door, then marched off down the corridor. But the wrong way. We were not heading toward the outside entrance at all, but deeper into the maze of prison passageways. Still, without a word, she halted in front of another door and opened it with a key. I stepped inside. The door clanged behind me. The bolt, slammed shut. The cell was identical with the one I had just left. 6 steps long, 2 wide, a single cot at the back. But this one was empty. As the guard's footsteps died away down the corridor, I leaned against the cold metal of the door. Alone. Alone behind these walls. I must not let my thoughts run wildly. I must be very mature and very practical. 6 steps, sit down on the cot. This one reeked even worse than the other. The straw seemed to be fermenting. I reached for the blanket. Someone had been sick on it. I thrust it away, but it was too late. I dashed for the bucket near the door and leaned weakly over it. At that moment, the light bulb in the ceiling went out. I groped back to the cot and huddled there in the dark, setting my teeth against the stink of the bedding, wrapping my coat tighter about me. The cell was bitter cold. Wind hammered against the wall. This must be near the outside edge of the prison. The wind had never shrieked so in the other one. What had I done to be separated from people this way? Had they discovered the conversation with the nurse at the doctor's office? Or perhaps some of the prisoners from Harlem had been interrogated and the truth about our group was known. Maybe my sentence was solitary confinement for years and years. In the morning, my fever was worse. I could not stand even long enough to get my food from the shelf in the door, and after an hour or so, the plate was taken away, untouched. Toward evening, the pass-through dropped open again, and the hunk of coarse prison bread appeared. By now, I was desperate for food, but less able to walk than ever. Whoever was in the hall must have seen the problem. A hand picked up the bread and hurled it toward me. It landed on the floor beside the cot, where I clawed for it and gnawed it greedily. For several days, while the fever raged, my supper was delivered in this manner. Mornings, the door squealed open, and a woman in the blue smock carried the plate of hot gruel to the cot. I was as starved for the sight of a human face as for the food, and tried in a hoarse croak to start a conversation. But the woman, Obviously, a fellow prisoner would only shake her head with a fearful glance toward the hall. The door also opened once a day to let in the trustee from medical supply with a dose of some stinging yellow liquid from a very dirty bottle. The first time he entered the cell, I clutched at his sleeve. "Please," I rasped. "Have you seen an 84-year-old man, white hair, a long beard? Corrie Ten Boom. You must have taken medicine to him." The man tugged loose. I don't know anything." The cell door slammed back against the wall, framing the guard. "Solitary prisoners are not permitted to talk. If you say another word to one of the worker duty prisoners, it will be called to coast for the duration of your sentence." And the door banged behind the two of them.
The same trustee was also charged with recording my temperature each time he came. I had to take off my shirt and place a thermometer between my arm and the side of my body. It did not look to me like an accurate system, kind of like some of the head thermometers that are going on these days. 92.7. Oh, really? Okay. But sure enough, by the end of the week, an irritable voice called through the food slot. "Get up and get the food yourself. Your fever's gone. You won't be waited on again." I felt sure that the fever had not gone, but there was nothing for it but to creep, trembling, to the door for my plate. When I had replaced it, I would lie down again on the smelly straw, steeling myself for the bawling out I knew would come. "Look at the great lady back in bed again. Are you going to lie there all day long?" Why lying down was such a crime I could never understand, nor indeed what one was supposed to accomplish if one got up. Thoughts, now that I was alone, were a bigger problem than ever. I could no longer even pray for family and friends by name, so great was the fear and longing wrapped around each one. "Those I love, Lord," I would say. "You know them. You see them. Oh, bless them all." Thoughts were enemies. That prison bag, how many times I opened it in my mind and pawed through all the things I had left behind. A fresh blouse, aspirin, a whole bottle of them, toothpaste with a kind of pepperminty taste, and then I would catch myself. How ridiculous such thoughts. If I had to do it again, would I really put those little personal comforts ahead of human lives? Of course not. But in the dark nights, as the wind howled and the fever pulsed, I would draw that bag out of some dark corner of my mind and root through it once again. A towel to lay on the scratchy straw, an aspirin. Such a good description. I mean, I think about dark times I've had when I've gone back to think about things that should have done or could have done, or that are false comforts. And she,
The Israelites. If only we had fresh fruit when we were slaves.
right.
And it was all free. Yeah.
In only one way was this new cell an improvement over the first one. And by the way, I know we usually mention this. We are past 9, so I've probably learned we're going past the 9 o'clock hour. So this one had a window. 7 iron bars ran across it, 4 bars up and down. It was high in the wall, much too high to look out of, but through those 28 squares, I could see the sky. All day long, I kept my eyes fixed on that bit of heaven. Sometimes clouds moved across the squares, white or pink or edged with gold, and when the wind was from the west, I could hear the sea. Best of all, for nearly an hour each day, gradually lengthening as the spring sun rose higher, a shaft of checkered light streamed into the dark little room. As the weather turned warmer and I grew stronger, I would stand up to catch the sunshine on my face and chest, moving along the wall with the moving light, climbing at last onto the cot to stand on tiptoe in the final rays. As my health returned, I was able to use my eyes longer. I had been sustaining myself from my scriptures a verse at a time. Now, like a starving man, I gulped entire gospels at a reading, seeing whole the magnificent drama of salvation. And as I did, an incredible thought prickled the back of my neck. Was it possible that all of this, it seemed so wasteful and so needless, this war, Scheveningen prison, this very cell, None of it was unforeseen or accidental? Could it be part of the pattern first revealed in the Gospels? Hadn't Jesus, and here my reading became intent indeed, hadn't Jesus been defeated as utterly and unarguably as our little group and our small plans had been? But if the Gospels were truly the pattern of God's activity, then defeat was only the beginning. I would look around the bare little cell and wonder what conceivable victory could come from a place like this. The prison expert in the first cell had taught me to make a kind of knife by rubbing a corset stay against the rough cement floor. It seemed to me strangely important not to lose track of time. And so, with a sharp-boned stay, I scratched a calendar on the wall behind the cot. As each long, featureless day crawled to a close, I checked off another square. I also started a record of special dates beneath the calendar. February 28, 1944, arrest. February 29, 1944, transport to Scheveningen. March 16, 1944, beginning of solitary. And now a new date, April 15, 1944, my birthday in prison. My birthday had to mean a party, but I searched in vain for a single cheerful object. At least in the other cell there had been bright bits of clothing, the Baroness's red hat, Frau Mike's yellow blouse. How I regretted now my own lack of taste in clothes. At least I would have a song at my party. I chose one about the Bride of Haarlem tree. She would be in full bloom now. The children's song brought it all close. The bursting branches, the petals raining like snow on the brick sidewalk. Quiet in there! A volley of blows sounded on my iron door. Solitary prisoners are to keep silent. I sat on the cot, opened the Gospel of John, and read until the ache in my heart went away. That'd be a good place to read for the ache in your heart.
Yeah, the Gospel of John.
2 days after my birthday, I was taken for the first time to the big, echoing shower room. A grim-faced guard marched beside me, her scowl forbidding me to take pleasure in the expedition. But nothing could dim the wonder of stepping into that wide corridor after so many weeks of close confinement. At the door to the shower room, several women were waiting. Even in the strict silence, this human closeness was joy and strength. I scanned the faces of those coming out, but neither Betsy nor Nolly was there, nor anyone else from Haarlem. And yet, I thought, they are all my sisters. How rich is anyone who can simply see human faces? It would be a good posture for us to adopt. Mm-hmm. The shower, too, was glorious. Warm, clean water over my festering skin, streams of water through my matted hair. I went back to my cell with a new resolve. The next time I was permitted a shower, I would take with me 3 of my Gospels. Solitary was teaching me that it was not possible to be rich alone. And I was not alone much longer. Into my solitary cell came a small, busy black ant. I'd almost put my foot where he was one morning as I carried my bucket to the door when I realized the honor being done me. I crouched down and admired the marvelous design of legs and body. I apologized for my size and promised I would not so thoughtlessly stride about again. After a while, he disappeared through a crack in the floor. But when my evening piece of bread appeared on the door shelf, I scattered some crumbs, and to my joy, he popped out almost at once. Picked up a heroic piece, struggled down the hole with it, and came back for more. It was the beginning of a relationship. Now, in addition to the daily visit of the sun, I had the company of this brave and handsome guest. In fact, soon of a whole small committee. If I was washing out clothes in the basin or sharpening the point on my homemade knife when the ants appeared, I stopped at once to give them my full attention. It would have been unthinkable to squander 2 activities on the same bit of time. What perspective. I'll let you.
She's been alone for a long time.
Yeah.
If you're reading that in any other context, But I think it, solitary. We weren't made for solitary. We weren't. We were made for fellowship. She's singing about that in this story.
Yeah.
One evening, as I was crossing another long, long day from the calendar scratched on my wall, I heard shouts far down the corridor. They were answered closer by. Now noisy voices came from every direction. How unusual for the prisoners to be making a racket. Where were the guards? The shelf in my door had not been closed since the bread came 2 hours ago. I pressed my ear to it and listened, but it was hard to make sense of the tumult outside. Names were being passed from cell to cell. People were singing, others pounding on their doors. The guards must all be away. Please, let's be quiet, a voice nearby pleaded. Let's use this time before they get back. What's happening? I cried through the open slot. Where are the guards? At a party, the same voice answered me. It's Hitler's birthday. Then these must be their own names, people were shouting down the corridor. This was our chance to tell where we were, to get information. I'm Corrie Ten Boom, I called through the food shelf. My whole family is here somewhere. Oh, has anyone seen Casper Ten Boom, Betsy Ten Boom, Nolly Van Werden, and Willem Ten Boom? I shouted names until I was hoarse and heard them repeated from mouth to mouth down the long corridor. I passed names too, to the right and to the left, as we worked out a kind of a system. After a while, answers began to filter back. Miss Van der Elst is in cell 228. P.T.'s arm is much better. Some of the messages I could hardly bear to relay. The hearing was very bad. He sits in the cell without speaking. To my husband Joost, our baby died last week. Along with personal messages were rumors about the world outside, each more wildly optimistic than the last. There's a revolution in Germany. The Allies have invaded Europe. The war cannot last 3 weeks longer. At last, some of the names I had shouted began to return. Betsy Ten Boom is in cell 312. She says to tell you that God is good.
Oh, Betsy.
Oh, that was Betsy. That was every inch Betsy. Then, Nolly Van Werden was in cell 318, but she was released more than a month ago. Released? Oh, thank God. Two released. News from the men's section was longer returning, but as it did, my heart leapt higher and higher. Peter Van Werden, released. Herman Sluring, released. Willem Ten Boom, released. As far as I could discover, every single one taken in the raid on the Bayeux, with the exception of Betsy and me, had been freed. Only about Father could I discover no news at all, although I called his name over and over into the murmuring hall. No one seemed to have seen him. No one seemed to know. It was perhaps a week later that my cell door opened and a prison trustee tossed a package wrapped in brown paper onto the floor. I picked it up, hefted it, turned it over and over. The wrapping paper had been torn open and carelessly retied, but even though through the disarray I could spot Nolly's loving touch. I sat on the cot and opened it. There, familiar and welcoming as a visit from home, was the light blue embroidered sweater. As I put it on, I seemed to feel Nolly's arms circling my shoulders. Also inside the package were cookies and vitamins, needle and thread, and a bright red towel. How Nolly understood the gray color hunger of prison. She had even wrapped the cookies in gay red cellophane. I was biting into the first one when an inspiration came to me. I dragged the cot out from the wall to stand under the naked overhead bulb. Climbing on it, I fashioned a lampshade with the paper. A cheery red glow at once suffused the bleak little room. I was rewrapping the cookies in the brown outer paper when my eyes fell on the address written in Nolly's careful hand, slanting upward towards the postage stamp. But Nolly's handwriting did not slant. The stamp! Hadn't a message once come to the Bayeux under a stamp? Penciled in the tiny square beneath. Laughing at my own overwrought imagination, I moistened the paper in the basin water and worked the stamp gently free. Words! There were There was definitely writing there, but it was so tiny I had to climb again onto the cot and hold the paper close to the shaded bulb. I know all about that. All the watches in your closet are safe. Safe then. Then Yusi and Hank and Mary, they'd gotten out of the secret room. They'd escaped. They were free. I burst into racking sobs, then heard heavy footsteps bearing down the corridor. Hastily, I jumped down from the cot and shoved it back to the wall. The pass-through clattered open. What's the commotion in here? It's nothing. I won't do it again. The slot in the door snapped shut. How had they managed it?
Mm-hmm.
How had they gotten past the soldiers? Never mind.
Mm-hmm.
Dear Lord, you were there, and that was all that mattered.
The cell door opened to let in a German officer, followed by the head matron herself. My eyes ran hungrily over the well-pressed uniform with its rows of brilliant colored battle ribbons. Miss Ten Boom, the officer began in excellent Dutch. I have a few questions I believe you can help me with. The matron was carrying a small stool, which she leapt to set down for the officer. I stared at her. Was this obsequious creature the terrible voiced terror of the women's wing? The officer sat down, motioning me to take the cot. There was something in that gesture that belonged to the world outside the prison. As he took out a small notebook and began to read names from it, I was suddenly conscious of my rumpled clothes, my long, ragged fingernails. To my relief, I honestly did not know any of the names he read. Now I understood the wisdom of the ubiquitous Mr. Smith. The officer stood up. Will you be feeling well enough to come for your hearing soon? Again, that ordinary human manner. Yes, I hope so. The officer stepped out into the hall, the matron bobbing and scurrying after him with the stool. It was the 3rd of May. I was sitting on my cot sewing. Since Nolly's package had been delivered, I had a wonderful new occupation. One by one, I was pulling the threads from the red towel, and with them embroidering bright figures on the pajamas that I had only recently stopped wearing beneath my clothes. A window with ruffled curtains, a flower with an impossible number of petals and leaves. I had just started work on the head of a cat over the right pocket when the food shelf in the door banged open and shut with a single motion. And there on the floor of the cell lay a letter. I dropped the pajamas and sprang forward. Nolly's writing. Why should my hand tremble as I picked it up? The letter had been opened by the censors, held by them too. The postmark was over a week old. But it was a letter from home, the very first one. Why the sudden fear? I unfolded the paper. Corrie, can you be very brave? No, I couldn't be brave. I forced my eyes to read on. I have news that is very hard to write you. Father survived his arrest by only 10 days. He is now with the Lord. I stood with the paper between my hands so long that the daily shaft of sunlight entered the cell and fell upon it. Father, the letter glittered in the crisscross light as I read the rest. Nolly had no details, not how or where he had died, not even where he was buried. Footsteps were passing on the coconut matting. I ran to the door and pressed my face to the closed pass-through. Please, oh please. The steps stopped. The shelf dropped open. What's the matter? Please, I've had bad news. Oh please, don't go away. Wait a minute. The footsteps retreated, then returned with a jingle of keys. The cell door opened. Here. The young woman handed me a pill with a glass of water. It's a sedative. This letter just came, I explained. It says my father has died. The girl stared at me. Your father? She said in astonished tones. I realized how very old and decrepit I must look to this young person. She stood in the doorway a while, obviously embarrassed at my tears. Whatever happened, she said at last, you brought it on yourself by breaking the laws. Dear Jesus, I whispered as the door slammed and her footsteps died away. How foolish of me to have called for human help when you are here. To think that Father sees you now, face to face. To think that he and Mama are together again, walking those bright streets. I pulled the cot from the wall, and below the calendar scratched another date. March 9, 1944. Father, released.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Doesn't change anything. Doesn't change the hardness. Doesn't change the fact that, I mean, gosh, we knew what was going to happen before we started reading this book.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for joining us.
Yes. It's good to, even though we're not reading, I mean, we're not alone in the reading of this. And we're in this story together.
I think on Thursday, something happened in the 5th.
Oh, is there another
there may
meeting?
be a meeting,
book club
so
meeting, maybe?
Look into that and sign up and get together and talk about it because it's a lot. It's a lot to talk about it. Sorry we went 20 minutes over tonight.
5 minutes less than last week.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Chapter 10 is heavy, and so thank you.
Yeah, check out the song.
Yeah. Good
Peace,
night.
y'all. Good night.